The chandelier threw a clean, deliberate light across the linen. Crystal chimed faintly whenever a server passed. The sound seemed too polite to belong to the moment that had just unraveled beneath it. At table 8, silverware lay abandoned. Wines breathed in half-empty glasses, and a child's sob filled the room like wind through an unlatched door. Miguel's head was thrown back, his face red and streaked, small fists pounding the table where an untouched plate of fish sat cooling. He was 5 years old, in a jacket that smelled faintly of cologne and detergent, and there was nothing theatrical about the way he cried. It was the kind of crying that had been practiced in quiet rooms and on sleepless nights, a deep, continuous ache that had found its way into the public air of an upscale restaurant and refused to be domesticated. Ricardo kept his fingers curved around a glass he wasn't drinking from, the label of the winery an accidental barrier between him and the child. The investors, men and women wearing the same thin armor of calm as their phones buzzed with other lives, watched with polite distance. One of them shifted his chair and, with the economy of movement Ricardo had come to rely on, picked up his coat and left. It was a small betrayal that felt like cold water. A few tables over, someone whispered that it was a bad moment. The maitra's jaw tightened. The manager moved with efficient steps, first to offer a sweet, then to suggest that perhaps the boy could be taken outside. Ricardo waved the manager off. He didn't want to fuss. He had arranged this dinner to quiet the rattling teeth of another negotiation. There were numbers to be hardened into contracts by Monday. Miguel was supposed to be part of a life that had already been scheduled, a nice public fig leaf. The crying tested the arrangement. Ricardo leaned toward his son and said what he had always said when words were expected to suffice. "Miguel, enough now. Sit down. We'll go home." The voice that came was the voice of a man who had constructed his patience in boardrooms, measured, contained, an instruction rather than a comfort. Miguel's sobs rose, not in defiance, but in proof. He could not be reasoned with. He was a small animal, alarmed and abandoned. No one reached for Miguel, except a woman who wore her uniform like an apology. Laura had been serving that room all evening. Her hands were steady, skin the color of coffee left too long in a cup, nails short and clear. When she approached, she carried a child's plate but set it down as if not to intrude. She crouched where a mother should have crouched, near Miguel's knees, her apron pooled around her like a skirt. Her voice was low, almost conversational, as if she were speaking across a table in a kitchen instead of amid the hush of glass and expectation. "Close your eyes for me," she said in Portuguese first. Then, when Miguel blinked, "Close your eyes, little one. Can you breathe with me?" It was not a command. It was an invitation. Ricardo watched, feeling the room constrict and tilt. He had arranged his life around control, the perfect meals, the right school, the best pediatrician on retainer. But control did not come with the language of lullabies. He had not learned how to breathe with his son. Miguel's breath hitched and then slowed. Laura reached out just the slightest touch to his knuckles, and her fingers were warm. She did not try to distract him with a toy or bribe him with a promise. She spoke to him like someone speaking to a child who had been taught grief in private. "He only needs a mother," she said. The words landed in the middle of the table like a normal thing dropped in water. Silence widened. It was only 6 words. They had no legal weight, no guarantee. They were not an accusation, and yet they were acute enough to be a mirror held up to Ricardo's face. Every reflective surface in the room seemed to answer back. The silver, the watch faces, the gleam on Ricardo's tie. He heard, for the first time in years, the particular hollowness that had sat beside their family table ever since Beatrice had died. Miguel's posture shifted as if some invisible knot had been eased. His crying dwindled into quiet hiccups. He looked up at Laura through the fronds of disheveled hair, and then, with a movement that was all animal need and nothing cynical, he leaned forward and wrapped his small arms around her waist. He clung to her in the way a child clings to shore when the tide pulls at his feet. People in the restaurant resumed their postures as if nothing had happened. A few chairs creaked, a phone dimmed. Money, obligation, propriety reasserted themselves, but for Ricardo, down to the broken hinge of an old photograph in his wallet, something had shifted. The investors were still there in the periphery. A contract still needed signing, but the room had given him a fact he could no longer ignore. Laura straightened slowly, a mother in the way. Some people carry centuries of muscle memory. She didn't smile. Her face was private, and in that privateness was the reason Miguel had accepted her arms. She handed him back to Ricardo with the same deft, hesitant tenderness she had accepted him. A transaction in trust. Ricardo felt the weight of the child's body as if it were evidence. "Thank you," he said to Laura, and the word felt insufficient. Miguel clung to his father's coat in the restlessness that followed, as if testing a new seam. There would be explanations in the car, perhaps distractions, maybe a promise. For the moment, the man at the center of all of Ricardo's plans felt his throat go dry, and the hotel of his composure had no concierge. If this moment reached you, if it pulled at something you recognize, consider liking the video and subscribing for more stories that look small but keep finding the things we've lost. After the restaurant, the city moved with its indifferent infrastructure. Ricardo walked the short distance back to the car and kept his hands in the pockets of his coat, the way a person keeps a secret. Miguel slept with his cheek against Ricardo's chest, light and fitful in sleep. Night terrors had been a frequent caller at the edge of Ricardo's life, and tonight the child slept as if peace were a stranger visiting briefly. The house was too quiet. The silence had been a fixture since Beatrice. Photographs lined the hallway. Beatrice laughing in a sun-drenched field, Beatrice with a crown of wildflowers on a summer morning, Beatrice holding Miguel when his legs were still knobby and tentative. Photos had become Ricardo's altar, trimmed frames, glass, the exact angle that flattened sorrow into memory. He had kept busy with work because work was the only place that required clean, measurable results. At the office, one could lead projects, close deals, see numbers change, with a clarity that human hearts refused to offer. Donna Kelia found him in the kitchen before he could make it to the study. She was a presence as steady as the sun on his mother's side, an unflashy keeper of the house and of small truths. Her apron smelled faintly of lemon. She watched him fold his hands around a cup of coffee without asking for anything. She had been with them since before Beatrice died, and her reserve had outlasted many of the passing anxieties that came through the house. "You were late," she said, not as an accusation, but as a note. Her voice had the compact authority of someone who had tended both plants and people into healthier shapes. "He didn't fall asleep until after you left. He cried," Ricardo said, and the word landed hollow. He hadn't meant to sound defensive, but the habit of defenses had been polished by years of necessity. Donatelia's eyes found the photograph of Beatrice on the mantel. "You can't go back," she said, more to the room than to him, then softer. "But you can be here." There it was, the small, inescapable calculus. Presence over presence. The phrase had the moral clarity of a proverb, and yet Ricardo felt the old reflexive bargain flicker in him. Presence required cancellations, rearranging, a making of time that was not negotiable. Business would go on, people could be scheduled. But being present could not be outsourced or bought or adequately delegated to a caregiver who kept the house tidy and the children fed. It required him. In the center of that requirement, Ricardo saw that the person who could have taught him how to do presence had been taken by the birth that had brought Miguel into the world. Beatrice was a hole in the pattern of life he had used to justify his absence. That night he did not sleep well. He made the inventory of his failures the way a general might tally lost territory, missed recitals, school mornings where boxes of cereal had been handed out like tokens, late campaigns where dinner was a palatable inconvenience. Miguel's teacher had once called with a note about his silences during circle time, how he watched other children form clusters and didn't quite join. Ricardo had answered with a check for a summer camp, as if activities could be a substitute for arms. There were other things that came back with the taste of regret. He remembered the hospital corridor and the fluorescent lights when the doctor entered and said something he had known was possible but not then prepared to carry. The months after Beatrice's death had been a fog of paperwork and condolence bouquets. He had retreated into work out of inertia and the need to keep the world functional for Miguel. They had learned to live around grief rather than through it. Miguel had been small and silent, and then, at 5, his grief moved into voice. Ricardo found himself replaying Laura's 6 words. He did not need to be told that his son needed a mother in order to love him. He needed to be told because what he had been offering was not enough. He only needs a mother. The phrase suggested a type of human presence Ricardo had not learned to manufacture. He had given toys, tutors, travel. He had attended the correct number of school events to be considered a good father in polite circles. But the sustaining, day in day out, intimate availability of a parent, of a mother, was not an accounting entry. It was a weather system. The next morning, Miguel woke at 7, and Ricardo, on impulse that felt more like a hunger than a decision, made coffee and set a small plate of toast at the table. It was a minor rebellion against his old schedule of calls that began before breakfast. Miguel regarded the toast with suspicion, then took a bite, and for a moment they sat as if learning a ritual. Ricardo poured juice into a plastic cup with the care of someone fumbling in a language he had not properly learned. These were small gestures, and they mattered. When Miguel pushed away from the table and took his toy airplane to the living room, Ricardo followed. They built a runway from couch cushions. The plane's engines were a whisper. Miguel laughed at some small imagined obstacle, then looked up at his father as if measuring whether the sound would be reciprocated. Ricardo laughed too. The sound felt foreign in his chest. It was not a reversal. It was the beginning of a possibility. But possibility, in a life of meetings and commitments, needs a scaffolding. The scaffolding in this case would be simple, consistent acts, not grand promises. Ricardo understood that he could not reconstruct childhood in a weekend retreat. The work would be patient and slow. The 6 words hung in the air as a guidepost. He found himself thinking of Laura. He did not know her beyond the restaurant, the shape of her hands under the table, the way she had crouched. But he could not shake the image of Miguel in her arms. That image was an accusation and a beacon, both. The manager of the restaurant had been discreet yet efficient. When Ricardo returned a day later, not under the guise of a patron, but with the directness of a man who needed something that dinner could not provide, he asked for Laura. There was an awkwardness to asking for a waitress by name. It required him to admit that the restaurant had altered him. The manager's eyes flicked to Miguel's photo on Ricardo's phone and then softened. He told Ricardo when Laura worked, where she lived, details given in the careful cadence of someone who understood boundaries. Laura's apartment was 2 subway stops away in a neighborhood that still smelled of wood smoke in the evenings. The building had the kind of wear that told you it had been lived in for generations. The stairwell held the sounds of other people's lives, music seeping through doors, a child crying in a distant hall, everyday life in layers. Ricardo had never been to a place without valet parking. He felt slightly unmoored walking up the stairs with an investment in a stranger's name. When Laura opened the door, she looked at him cautiously. She had the look of someone who had learned to answer questions economically. She was not surprised to see a stranger. Life at the restaurant invited interactions beyond the transactional. Her apartment was small and tidy, with a child's chair pushed back against a kitchenette. On the table was a scattered stack of paperwork and a photograph of a girl around 8, hair braided in 2 small ropes, smiling like a person who kept her joy for special moments. That photograph stopped Ricardo in his tracks. "Is this Helena?" he asked, though the question was intrusive. Laura's hand found the photo, and she breathed out as if the sound had been stored inside for a long time. "My daughter," Laura said. She did not explain. Her voice held a reserve that was neither cold nor curt. It was catalogued grief. "I don't have her with me." The hours that followed were not cinematic. There was no melodramatic confession. Laura sat across from Ricardo at the small kitchen table and told, in small measured sentences, what had happened. How Fernando, once a boyfriend, had argued and fought for custody. How money and an unstable living situation were used against her in a way that felt deeply unfair. How social workers and paperwork and the pace of legal systems had conspired to keep a child from her. Her agency in the telling was a quiet dignity. She took responsibility where she should, explained the missteps, and then, with a stubborn economy of words, stated the cold facts. "I work nights," she said. "I do my best. I keep a job. But court considered everything. They said I wasn't stable." Her jaw tightened when she said the word stable, as if the justifications only made the wound more visible. "Helena is with his sister now," she added. "They live in the suburbs. I can see her on Sundays, but it isn't the same." Ricardo listened and felt guilt happen in stages. There was a private partisan part of him that wanted to fix things as one would fix a leaking pipe. Find the right person, sign the right check, reroute the stress. But a legal system that separated mothers from daughters was not a single malfunction. It was a lattice of social prejudice, poverty, and procedural blindness. Money would open doors, but it would not reconstruct years. There was humility in the knowledge that his help would be necessary, but not necessarily sufficient. When he offered to help, he did it tentatively. He did not pull a credit card as if he could purchase back a life. He sat across from Laura and said, "I want to help." He expected to be laughed at or resented. Instead, Laura's face changed in a way that made Ricardo think of a dam opening in slow motion. Someone who had kept hope tightly rationed and suddenly let a little out. But she did not take the offer easily. "People offer things when they're feeling generous," she said. "Then they disappear." Her voice was not accusatory. It was informed. She had learned the rhythm of promises. If you help, you must be prepared to be in it for the long haul. Not just a retainer, not a signature. Presents, paperwork, court dates, a team that cares enough to keep showing up. It was a logic that matched his new revelation at the restaurant. Presents again, but multiplied. She knew the terrain of the legal system because she had been forced there. She knew the forms, the hearings, the kind of favor that ended when the wine did. When Ricardo mentioned a lawyer, a name he had on a palmed card, Dr. Henrique, Laura's expression moved through 1,000 practical calculations. She had learned to be strategic, and there was a part of her that appreciated that Ricardo had resources, but resources had not kept her daughter close. "Signing paper helps," she said, "but it is not enough." Her eyes softened when she looked at the photograph on the table. Helena needs a mother who can be there at night, who can bandage the small things, who talks and listens. The system says stability and counts numbers, but it is the nights and mornings that save a child. Ricardo felt the truth of that in his sternum. The nights, the mornings, those were the places his work had abandoned. He had not realized how many of his decisions had simply been opt-outs from the slow, repetitive labor of parenthood. He had come because of guilt and because of the image of Miguel in a waitress's arms. He had not expected that what he saw would be a mirror for another human life. Laura's story reframed the 6 words he'd heard at the restaurant into a more complicated sentence. He only needs a mother, and some children only need one. Laura did not accept his help immediately. She made it clear that any assistance would require transparency, and she had a list of conditions that were as much about dignity as about legal strategy. She needed someone who would not treat her like an object to be rescued, but as a partner in reclaiming her child. She wanted a lawyer who would show up to court and see the entire family history, not some snapshot intended to discredit her. Ricardo agreed to those conditions even before he had the strategy lined up. He left her apartment with a piece of paper in his pocket, an address written in a hand that had not been trained to make things round, and the photograph of Helena seated in his mind. He thought about the parallel lines of absence in both houses. A wealthy man who had given everything but time, and a working mother who had been stripped of her child by circumstances that rewarded conformity over care. That week was a blur of maneuvers in Ricardo's world. Meetings that once seemed paramount moved to the margins. He missed a conference call and felt that old familiar panic. Yet when Miguel arrived home from preschool and clutched at the hem of his sleeve, Ricardo made dinner and sat while the child ate, not because of a performance he could show at a later date, but because the child's presence required him. It was awkward at first, like learning how to speak in a mirror. They began to have small rituals. A paper airplane launched from the hallway, a nightly reading on the couch, where Miguel drifted in mid-sentence, and Ricardo read the same line again until the boy fell asleep. The motif of hands became important. Ricardo learned the shape of Miguel's grasp, the way the child's fingers curled around the edge of a sheet of paper. He practiced the art of returning touch, rubbing a small shoulder, tucking a blanket in, answering the midnight question that had always seemed urgent and trivial at once. Each small act was a vote cast towards habitation. He grew less certain of numbers and more certain of the weather of his home. He also started to watch Laura from a distance, not in the way of surveillance, but in the way of a man who had been touched by a kindness and wanted to learn more about the source. He saw her at work, moving among tables with the same deliberate care, kneeling sometimes the way she had with Miguel. Once he saw her speak into a phone in the alley, the conversation fierce and fragile. There was a moment when she looked up, and their eyes met across a crowd. Neither of them smiled. The look was not one of romance. It was an acknowledgement that their lives had briefly intersected, and that the intersection had consequences. Ricardo called his lawyer. Dr. Henrique was precise and efficient, the kind of man who did not waste words and believed in the power of preparation. Ricardo told him, in the clipped tone of someone requesting a project, that he was considering helping a woman in a custody matter. Henrique's eyebrows rose only slightly. "We will need documents," he said. "Proof of current situation, any record of the prior judgment, evidence of change. The courts respond to continuity." Ricardo understood the plan in terms of meetings, checklists, and the dull work of evidence gathering, but he also felt, as he always had, the uncomfortable weight of the moral ledger. Money could hire a good lawyer, but it could not conjure trust from nothing. He needed Laura to say yes to collaboration. She needed to trust a man whose hands had always aimed at the ledger and not the lullaby. The two small families orbited each other in the city for weeks. Miguel began to eat more of his vegetables. He started to tell short, meandering stories about school, about a boy named João who had built a tower with blocks, and about a snake that had been more of a stick. He seemed lighter, but lightness has a fragile architecture. It must be supported. Laura, meanwhile, stayed present in her work and in the small fight of being visible. She assembled a folder of documents in meticulous order, letters from friends, notes from a shelter that had once housed her, affidavits from neighbors who could speak to her stability. She did the work the system required because she had to, but also because the act of assembling her life on paper gave it a new coherence. There were awkward moments. Ricardo learned not to overstep, and often overstepped. He would show up at the restaurant with bags of groceries and insist upon bringing lunch to Laura, who received it politely, but with the grace of someone who had trained herself not to be overwhelmed. Once, he offered to pick up Helena from school just to test the waters and was rebuffed. He had to learn the difference between helpfulness and interference. On a rainy Thursday evening, when the city's streets swept reflections off the asphalt and the neon of the avenue blurred, a call came in from the restaurant. Laura needed a ride home. The bus had been late. The night shift had run longer than expected. Ricardo was not a man who often drove through the rain without a reason, but his car pulled up under the awning, and Laura climbed in holding a smudged plastic bag with receipts. There was a quiet in the car, as if everyone was listening for the road to tell a story. "This won't change things," she said, eyes on the passing blur. "I'm not looking for charity." "I don't want to give you charity," Ricardo answered. "I want to be present." She turned to him then, and for the first time there was a softness that had nothing to do with obligation in her face. "Presence costs," she said. "It asks for time you might not be ready to give." "I'll make it a priority," he said. It was a small vow, and yet in the cadence of it there was a seriousness he had not felt during many a negotiation. He meant to honor it. At Laura's door she paused. "If you help," she said, "prepare to be inconvenienced." Ricardo smiled, a little sheepish. "Inconvenience I can pay for," he said, because he could not yet name the true cost. He thought of mornings and nights, of the steady erosion of opportunities lost, and he felt the tremble of someone about to enter unfamiliar work. When he left, he watched her disappear up the stairwell. The rain had slackened to a mist. In his hands he held the possibility of being a part of the scaffolding Laura had demanded, but he also held the knowledge that the scaffolding required time and stubbornness, and most of all, it required a willingness to accept that money is necessary but not sufficient. He returned home and found Miguel asleep on the couch. A paper airplane collapsed in his lap. Ricardo placed a blanket over the child, and in that simple motion felt the small incremental shift of a life being rearranged. He sat for a long time in the quiet, thinking of the restaurant's hush and the exactness of Laura's 6 words. They had seemed at first a mirror for his own failures. Now they echoed with a further resonance, an indictment of systems that asked mothers to be perfect and punished them when they were not, an invitation to men like him to stop imagining that accidents of love could be remedied by transactions. The next steps felt both enormous and mundane. There would be calls to his lawyer, meetings with social workers, the clumsy navigation of a court calendars. There would also be the small daily acts, a prompt to the preschool to sign a permission slip, the discipline of arriving home for dinner at predictable times, reading the same book until Miguel's voice softened into sleep. There was paperwork, and there was the paradox that paperwork mattered because it could unstick a bureaucracy that often moved only for evidence. And Ricardo understood the risk of interfering. He had seen good intentions do damage when they were handed down without humility. He had been that man once. His offer must be partnership, not pawn. Laura's life did not need to be rescued as if it were merely a problem to be solved. It needed to be recognized as whole, with her own agency intact. He called Dr. Henrique and asked him to prepare. They would need to look at the previous custody judgment, gather testimony, and map out the strategy. Henrique insisted on caution and thoroughness. "Courts are practical," he said. "They like facts. We'll show them you've offered stable assistance, that there's a plan for Helena's schooling, her housing, and a steady contact structure." Henrique's tone was pragmatic, but Ricardo knew that even the best plan could flounder without the one thing he had just started trying to master. Presence? There were early pains. The staff at the preschool eyed him with professional curiosity. Miguel at times reverted to old patterns, clinging to broccoli for comfort or curling into himself when a stranger entered. These relapses were not defeats, but reminders that change takes time. Ricardo persisted. He began to set boundaries at work that felt like amputations at first. No more Sunday calls, no meetings that started before 9 in the morning. He negotiated his calendar like someone learning a new language of devotion. In the restaurant, Laura continued to move among tables with a careful humility. She accepted help when it made sense, declined when it didn't, and held to a dignity that had been carved by necessity. She filed documents, met with advocates who brought letters of support, and rehearsed testimony in the quiet of her apartment with a small, stubborn tenderness. Weeks turned into a rhythm. There were court filings and meetings that read like a dossier being assembled. There was the slow repair of a home life that had been out of balance for years. Ricardo learned to measure his days by different standards. The sound of Miguel's bike chain, the smell of toast burning, the warmth of small hands in his own. The 6 words from the restaurant sometimes came back to him in the middle of a day. He only needs a mother. And he would mouth them like a benediction, as if they were a map rather than a verdict. One morning, on the way to preschool, Miguel reached for his hand and squeezed. It was a small human currency, and Ricardo felt it as rich as any contract ever signed. He smiled back, and the smile did not feel like a performance. But the path ahead was not made only of small victories. The legal world was a series of gates and doors that needed opening. Fernando loomed as an adversary, not because he was a villain in a textbook sense, but because his claim to custody stood on a different platform, one of stability as the court had seen it. He had family who vouched for him, a sister with a steady home. Laura had to counter that with proof that she had built the scaffolding to receive her child home. Proof, in the end, was the currency that the court would recognize. Ricardo and Laura had an argument in public that evening, 2 people who tried to do the right thing, but were not yet fluent in the grammar of each other's lives. It was not dramatic, it was practical. She asked him why he wanted to help. He said it was because he had finally seen his son. She demanded more. Why did he think he could understand? He told her he didn't, and that was the honest beginning of a new kind of allyship. "You're intervening in my life," Laura said, voice steady but edged. "I need help, not pity." "I know," Ricardo said. "I can't promise more than my time. I can promise I'll be present. I can promise to stand with you." She looked at him then, with an expression that could have been a grimace or a guard opening. "Be careful how you say stand," she warned. "I've stood on the wrong shoulders before." They left it there. No declarations, no rushed heroics. The argument clarified boundaries. He would help, she would accept, but on terms that respected her dignity. When Ricardo returned home that night, Miguel clambered into bed at an unheard-of hour and fell asleep, holding a small, battered stuffed rabbit. Ricardo sat at the edge of the bed and watched him breathe. The child's chest rose and fell. The rhythm was small, but each breath felt like currency being reclaimed. Ricardo understood that their families could not be simply yoked together with good intentions. The coming months would demand patience and a kind of stubborn endurance he had not had to practice before. There would be setbacks, there would be bureaucratic blindness, and there would be nights when the child woke and needed someone who had once been an absent fixture. He closed his eyes and for a moment let the image of the restaurant return. The chandelier, the hush, a waitress kneeling, 6 words that cut through gusto and decorum and landed in the heart of a problem. He had been humbled by a simple sentence. For all his wealth, the truth had been a person in an apron. On a Saturday morning, buoyed by a small tentative victory at a hearing that had recommended a reevaluation of Helena's placements, Ricardo found himself standing outside a small courthouse. Paperwork in hand, he tried to be the measured client he had trained his entire life to be. Instead, his thoughts took him back to the way Miguel had leaned into Laura. He thought about evenings spent making simple dinners and the part of him that no longer wanted to measure fatherhood in appearances. The door of the courthouse opened, and he felt like a man stepping into a room with a new vocabulary. He had money, skill, influence, all tools that could be wielded responsibly. But he also had to learn the primary task, to trade the habit of absence for the steadier work of showing up. He had already come this far because a waitress had said 6 truthful words, because a child had reached for someone who was not his mother and been embraced. That moment had done nothing anomalous, but everything true. It had exposed a need and invited repair. There were many things to be done. Evidence to gather, meetings with social workers, testimony to prepare, a small girl's custody to be argued with patience and deliberation. But in the pulse of his chest, running beneath the pragmatic rush of legalities, Ricardo felt something he had not felt in a long time, a quiet readiness to be inconvenient in the service of what mattered. He folded his hands around his paperwork and pushed open the courthouse door. The courthouse smelled of old varnish and the faint bleach of institutional cleaning. Papers rustled like a subordinate current beneath the higher tide of voices. Ricardo stepped inside with the careful gravity of someone bringing his life to a place that had already learned the language of judgment. His paperwork was neat in his hands, but his chest carried something less ordered. He had learned to hold space for awkwardness. Today, that awkwardness had teeth. Outside the courtroom, Laura waited with a clutch of folders banded by rubber bands and a face that had learned how to be practical under pressure. She looked different than the woman he had met at her kitchen table. Roads and small victories had given her a hard-earned steadiness. Helena was with her sister for the day. Social services had arranged a supervised exchange to protect the child from being yanked into conflict. Laura had accepted the arrangement with a composure that masked the way her stomach tightened. The courtroom filled slowly. Fernando arrived with his sister and a small entourage, his posture folded into a familiar blend of annoyance and entitlement. Dr. Henrique took his seat and arranged the evidence with surgical neatness. The judge presided like someone who had watched human lives fold into procedural shapes too many times to be surprised. A social worker, a preschool teacher, Donna Celia from Ricardo's house, and a neighbor who had written an affidavit for Laura took seats in the audience. They would be called to speak. The hearing began with technicalities, dates, citations, the cold mathematics of precedent, until it narrowed to the central human claims. Who could best provide continuity, bedtime presence, the kinds of small attentions the courts were increasingly willing to weigh? The judge asked direct questions. He had read the file but wanted to hear the texture that papers could not convey. Dr. Henrique opened with a map, dates of Laura's employment, evidence of stable housing, a documented pattern of childcare plans. He placed photographs on the counsel table, a child's room with small craft projects on the shelf, a calendar with consistent school pickups, a letter from a community center confirming Laura's volunteer hours. He did not offer sentiment. He offered pattern. The judge listened, jotting down notes. Next, the social worker described the re-evaluation, the home visit, the way Laura had organized Helena's clothes by color, the photos the child had of a favorite teacher taped to the wall. The social worker spoke in a voice that mixed empathy with procedural language. Ms. Almeida has met the criteria for stability, she said. There has been a demonstrable change from the prior assessment. She has consistent employment, reliable references, and a support network that includes neighbors willing to provide testimonial evidence. Fernando's counsel pounced on the gaps. He reminded the court of the earlier ruling, periods of unstable housing, the night shifts, the times when supervision had been sporadic. It was not malevolence so much as a rehearsal of caution, making the case that the court had once been right to favor a more steady home. He spoke about the sister's availability, about financial certainty and a schedule that could be counted upon. In the eyes of the law, predictability carries weight. Laura was called to the stand. She walked with the careful stride of someone who had rehearsed each step against the tremor of memory. When she spoke, it was measured but human. She told the story not as a plea, but as a ledger of truth. The job she had kept, the shelter she had used when things were at their worst, the neighbors who had watched Helena while she worked a double shift. She did not spare the court the shame of mistakes. She named them poor choices, a relationship that had not been safe. But she also named the corrections she had made. She had enrolled in parenting classes, set up a budget, arranged for a cousin to be on call when nights were long. She produced the calendar that showed the teachers' meetings she had attended, the charity letters that had helped with the deposit on her apartment. When the cross-examination came, Fernando's lawyer did not raise his voice. Instead, he used a steady, narrowing pressure. "You worked nights," he said. "Who was with Helena? Who could be there if she woke in the night? How would you respond to a fever?" Laura's jaw tightened for a beat. She had expected those questions. "I arranged for a friend to stay," she said. "I called family. When possible, I swapped shifts. I have done what the system asked and more. I am not perfect, but I am present, and I have built the scaffolding the court requires." There were small human interruptions. Helena's teacher read a short note about the child's attachment to Laura. A neighbor described the way Laura had run to help when a child had fallen in the building. Donatelia testified to Ricardo's changes, the dinners at the table, the way he had learned to read the same book until Miguel fell asleep, the stroller walks that had once belonged to the absent man now reclaimed. She spoke plainly, the kind of witness whose testimony carries the smell of detergent and the weight of long service. Mr. Alvarenga's life has changed. He's here. He shows up. One of the most delicate moments came when the preschool's director spoke. The director described Miguel's demeanor over months, the receding of a constant anxiousness, the lightning laugh that began to appear, the small risk of stepping into groups. "We noticed a difference," she said. "He seems more regulated. He sleeps more. He speaks about breakfasts he has with his father. And those are small things, but for a child they are large." Fernando's side presented spreadsheets of income, testimony about the sister's reliability, and character references. The judge asked questions that were neither cruel nor soft. He wanted evidence of long-term capacity. Judges are pragmatists. Sentiment gets weighed lightly unless it is translated into sustained practice. When Laura's turn to testify finally arrived, she had prepared a short statement. She did not look at Ricardo when she spoke, but he watched her hands, how they steadied on their own. "I have learned to be present for Helena in ways I couldn't when I was younger," she said. "I have learned how to keep a routine, to ask for help, to carry small proof. I am asking to be the one who sleeps in her doorway if she needs me. I am asking for time to show that those promises have teeth." There was no theatrical breakdown. Tears came quietly at the edges, brief, real, not staged. Laura's dignity remained intact. It was the kind of testimony that landed less like rhetoric and more like a lived fact. Dr. Henrique then presented a plan for shared custody that was deliberate and careful. A weekly calendar that gave Laura primary care with structured weekend visits for Helena with her sister, and a plan for holidays to be shared. There would be a monitored transition period, weekly check-ins with social services for 3 months, and a clause for re-evaluation if concerns arose. The plan did not deny Fernando his role. It proportioned time fairly while emphasizing the child's need for a mother who was present for the unglamorous hours, homework, scraped knees, night fears. The judge took the proposals into consideration, asked about logistics, probed for contingency plans. He noted the evidence of Laura's stability, the documented changes in Ricardo's engagement with Miguel, and the presence of a support network. The court's task was not to repair a person's life, but to assemble the best ecology for a child. At the end of the day, the judge did not announce a sweeping vindication. He charted a course based on what he had heard and the evidence presented. He awarded shared custody in a form that favored Laura's primary care, but recognized the importance of Ricardo's involvement and Fernando's continued visits with appropriate boundaries. The ruling included monitoring and a schedule for re-evaluation in 6 months. Sober measures designed to hold people to their commitments without promising perfection. Outside the courtroom, under the glass awning that filtered the afternoon, Laura's knees trembled for maybe the first time in weeks. Ricardo did not speak at first. He felt the ruling as a relief stitched with responsibility. This was not a single triumph. It was a call to continuance. They walked to a neutral meeting space arranged by social services for their reunion. Helena was there with her aunt at a small table reading a picture book. When she looked up and saw Laura, something in her face shifted from tentative curiosity to release. The child crossed the distance like someone going to shore and entered her mother's arms in a way that made the room shift. No music swelled. There was only the sound of 2 people breathing, into a moment that was at once ordinary and vast. Ricardo stepped back and watched, an adult who had been brought to the edge of his own life by an act of compassion. Laura thanked him with words that were modest and true. "You helped," she said. "You were there." Ricardo nodded. It seemed inferior to say too much. He had learned that presence is often visible in what one does not say. He had learned to stand without patronizing. Later, when they were outside, Helena skipping ahead with a small hop, Ricardo bought a pastry at a corner bakery and handed it to the child with the casual ease of someone practicing ordinary kindness. The weeks after the ruling were not a clean epilogue, but a slow, deliberate stitching. Laura and Helena moved through the city to the rhythm of school mornings and after-school homework. The monthly check-ins required by the court were factual and sometimes awkward. They asked for paperwork and minutes of visits, the kind of record-keeping that can feel intrusive, but also keeps promises honest. Fernando maintained his scheduled days, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes gratefully. There was tension, but not malice, two adults navigating the structure the court set. Ricardo learned to schedule his life in a new grammar. He insisted on being home for dinner at least 4 nights a week. He set his phone to an auto-reply when he was with Miguel. He mastered the small arts, tying shoelaces, making the exact kind of sandwich Miguel preferred, cleaning banana-smeared faces with the patience of someone discovering language. He did so imperfectly, committing faux pas like burning a pancake or delivering a bedtime story in inexact accents. But he kept the ritual. Miguel noticed. So did the teacher. Laura's life also reorganized. She took a different shift pattern when possible. She made friends who could pick up Helena when school ran late. She answered the court's monitoring calls with a weary steadiness. There were nights when she felt raw, old fears whispering that the system could turn again. But there were also mornings when Helena's small hand curled in hers and the world settled into a manageable course. The children responded to the new rhythms. Miguel's trust did not return like a faucet turned on. It came in small increments, the willingness to hold a hand at the park, to ask for a story, to let a nap unfold in the arms of someone who had once been absent. Helena rediscovered the ordinary pleasures of being mothered, a lunchbox packed by someone who remembered the exact snack she preferred, a braid that took time and care, a pillow smoothed just so for bedtime. Those tiny calibrations matter more than grand gestures. Ricardo and Laura developed an alliance that was practical and quiet. They did not fall into romance. They formed a partnership built around two children's needs. They communicated through shared calendars, quick text messages about pickups, the occasional longer conversation about school choices. Sometimes they argued about drop-off times or holiday schedules, but most often they met in the middle with the grown-up patience of people who had learned to keep promises. There were harder moments. One night, a storm knocked out the traffic lights. Ricardo was due for a business dinner he could not miss, but Miguel had a fever. He canceled the dinner and sat on the floor of his living room in a t-shirt, applying cool cloths and reading the same children's book until the fever eased. It felt like an expenditure of something he had never been asked for before. It was not heroic. It was simply something necessary. On another afternoon, Laura's ex-partner, Fernando, came to the playground with a contrite expression and rose to a fragile civility. There was a brief, misfired conversation about custody and resources, but it did not escalate. People learned to live adjacent to their pasts. Over time, the park became a shared geography. On Saturday mornings, the children met under a spreading jacaranda. Miguel ran with a toy airplane, and Helena built castles of sand. They taught each other small games. The adults sat on a bench a respectful distance away, Ricardo with the calm of someone who had learned to be content with the smallness of presence, Laura with the air of someone who had reclaimed a life that had been scattered. There were moments that returned the memory of the restaurant with a new angle. Once, as Miguel skidded to a stop and hugged Laura without thinking, a stranger on a bench watched and said aloud, "How did that happen?" The man meant the closeness between a child and a woman who was not his formal guardian. Laura answered with a short laugh and a tired honesty. A waitress said something once. She did not put a halo on the moment. She spoke of the kindness that had set things in motion, and the stranger nodded as if he had witnessed a small miracle. But Laura corrected him gently. "Not a miracle," she said. "A truth and a lot of work." There were smaller threads that stitched the two families together. Donna Celia came by the apartment sometimes with a pot of stew. She had a way of moving through the apartment that made everything feel less exposed. She would sit and knit while Miguel and Helena fought amicably over who would push the swing. Doncelia's presence was a gentle continuity, the kind of adult contact that quietly held a child's life in place. Ricardo kept learning to tolerate imperfections. He learned to be less inclined to fix and more inclined to be present. He would sit on the floor while Helena performed an elaborate game in which Miguel was the airplane and Helena the pilot. He would clap at the right moments, cheer when a tower did not tumble, and accept that parenting means sometimes being a willing audience. The motif of touch continued to matter. Miguel's small hands found Laura when he needed comfort, but he also brought that learned pattern home. One evening, while reading, Miguel laid his head in Ricardo's lap in a way that made the man still his breath. There was the quiet recognition that the man who had been defined by contracts and deadlines now kept his son's eyelids from fluttering into anxious dreams. "He only needs a mother." The phrase came back to Ricardo sometimes, not as a reproach now, but as a sober reminder of what children require, and that the task of caregiving is shared by many hands. Months passed. The monitor reports were positive. The judge, on re-evaluation, adjusted schedules slightly to increase the amount of time Helena spent with her mother. There were no grand public proclamations, no cinematic transformations. There was paperwork, and there was the daily labor of showing up. Then came a day that did not demand legal validation, but felt like a kind of moral report card. The two families organized a joint picnic at the park to mark Helena's return to school after the summer break. It was small: sandwiches, a thermos of juice, a sun-bleached blanket. Children ran in a loose orbit around the adults. Miguel taught Helena to make paper airplanes the way he had learned from his father. Helena taught Miguel a rhyming game. They argued over turns and then made amends. Ricardo carried a small wicker basket and handed out napkins. Laura braided Helena's hair on a picnic blanket, while Helena recited a trivial list of facts she'd learned in class. The scene would have been ordinary in the lives of ordinary families, and that ordinariness is precisely what counted as progress. Ricardo watched from the edge of the blanket. He felt the press of weeks, of mornings kept, of calls unanswered, of hours rearranged. The feeling that rose in him was not dramatic revelation, but a quiet gratitude. He had been touched by a human intervention at a restaurant, and that touch had been translated into weeks and months of uneven work that now allowed ordinary joy to happen without a veneer of performance. Near the picnic's end, Miguel, with cheeks still sticky from juice, ran toward Laura and wrapped his arms around her again. It was the same impulse as at the restaurant, but now informed by habit and safety. He pressed his face into her chest, and with the simplicity of a child who had both found and practiced trust, he held on. Laura's arms closed around him like a familiar garment. Ricardo walked closer and saw the expression on Laura's face, not a triumphant smile, but a quiet relief suffused with softness. Helena toddled around them, then paused and placed a small paper airplane into Miguel's hand. Miguel looked up, eyes bright like small ledger entries of happiness. Ricardo felt something uncoil in his ribs, a tension he had carried like a briefcase for years. He released it with no splash, only a small exhalation. "Oh, thank you," Laura said, not only to him, but to the entire unarticulated network of people that had made this possible: social workers, lawyers, neighbors, and the small acts of kindness from strangers. Her thanks included a glance toward the bench, where Dona Celia had dozed in the sun, where Dr. Henrique waved a hand in private greeting, where Fernando, somewhere at the periphery, supervised a small game of tag with an uneasy acceptance. The city moved on, indifferent in one sense, but in another sense transformed by this one new, ordinary configuration. Ricardo thought then of the chandelier, of the hush, of a woman in an apron kneeling by a small boy. He had been shaken by 6 words uttered in an otherwise forgettable evening. The phrase had not been a sentence of condemnation, but a mirror. It had shown him an absence he could fill, not with money, but with hours, and the willingness to be inconvenienced. He took Miguel's hand and felt the child's fingers curl around his. Laura sat down beside Helena and folded an extra scarf around her knees. They did not pretend that the future would be easy. They knew social systems can be stubborn and that human frailty can erupt at inconvenient times. They knew there would be days that tested their arrangement, but there was also a kind of daily proof now. Stacked photographs of pasta dinners eaten at kitchen tables, permission slips signed on time, a librarian who remembered Helena's favorite nickname. As the sunlight waned, someone, no one remarkable, simply an adult who noticed tenderness, said to the small cluster on the blanket, "Sometimes the simplest thing is the truest." It was not a platitude. It was a restatement of the day: presence over presence, truth over performance. When the afternoon ended, the families folded their blankets and carried the day's small detritus to the bins. The children were sleepy and content. Miguel walked between Ricardo and Laura, holding both hands, as if the choreography of that gesture were a new grammar, one that said aloud, without words, that a child's life could be held by more than one good hand. Ricardo walked with his son, his heart steady in a way it had not been months earlier. He watched Laura call to Helena and noticed, without fanfare, how small things mattered. The way Helena's hair fell out of the braid, and how Laura tucked it back with fingers that knew the child's scalp like a map. He felt grateful to a waitress who had done what she could, to a lawyer who had worked the system, to judges who recognized evidence of change, and to a child who had the courage to reach. On the subway home, Miguel fell asleep with his head against Ricardo's shoulder. The man's eyes were open, and he let the city pass by like a long ribbon. He thought about steps yet to be taken, the check-ins, the homework help, the nights he would stay up with a feverish child. He welcomed them as part of a life he had finally learned to live inside. At night, after tucking Miguel into bed, a ritual they now kept almost religiously, Ricardo sat by the window and allowed himself to revisit the simplicity of that restaurant moment. It had been a hinge. The 6 words, "He only needs a mother," had hung in the air like a small bell. They had not solved everything, but they had opened a door into work that could heal what paperwork could not, the patient construction of trust. There was no miraculous eradication of grief. Beatrice was still an absence that shaped their house, photographs still lined the mantel, but absence had been translated into a willingness to be present. That willingness, practiced daily, had already begun to change a child's weather. In the weeks that followed, the family settled into a new cadence. They shared birthdays with careful planning. They commemorated small victories, a first night without waking, a project at school that involved glue and patience, a new teacher who called to say a child had been brave. The children learned each other's rhythms. The adults learned to respect boundaries and to be generous without erasing another's agency. Sometimes, when the city lights blurred against an evening sky, Ricardo would remember the hush of the restaurant and the precise warmth of Laura's hand on Miguel's knuckles. He would speak to that memory as if tending a small plant, watering it with actions, being home, being present, being willing to be inconvenienced in service of a child. One day, several months into the new routine, Ricardo found himself in the restaurant again, not as a patron at a negotiation table, but as a father who had come to bring his son a small reward, a pastry, because he had done well in school that week. When they arrived, a new waitress took their table. Laura had moved shifts to reduce late nights and had started a small gig working at the community center on alternate weekends. The manager greeted Ricardo with the same discretion he had shown months before. He nodded toward the kitchen, where, if one looked closely, some servers moved with the same steady tenderness. Miguel ate the pastry and then, without ceremony, stood up and hugged Laura. It was the same motion as before, but now layered with the months of routine that had made it safe and ordinary. He embraced her as one would embrace a bedrock. People around them noticed in a passing way and then went back to their conversations. In the center of that ordinary noticing, something essential had shifted. A child's need had been met not by a single heroic act, but by a series of small, stubborn commitments. Ricardo watched the scene. A father, a son, a woman who had once been a catalyst but had become a partner, and felt the quietness that follows a long, right work. He thought of the title that would be told if someone asked the story in shorthand. The Millionaire's Son Cries Nonstop. The waitress says 6 words, and he embraces her like a mother. The headline captured the vivid instant that began it all, but it did not contain the months of paperwork, the mornings of toast, the nights of fever, the legal forms, the child's homework, the neighbor's affidavits, the courtroom's cautious pragmatism, nor the small, weary courage of a mother who rebuilt her life. If this story touched you, if it reminded you of how much presence matters, share a moment when someone's simple kindness changed the course of your family. Your story might be the 6 words someone else needs,